So this soldier is an eyewitness of the war in Cameroon after their independence. This is not a war in some ancient period where everything was black and white in what we perceive. It was in color. So I want you to take a look about this video.
Between Paris and its former African colonies. Bardet was sent to Cameroon between 1962 and 1964 in the western Bamileke region.
So this is an eyewitness. This is his picture. He was seen in 1962 to 1964. That means after Cameroon have half its independence, there was war going on, a struggle for the independence of Cameroon. That war was called by Ernest Wani as the struggle for independence of Cameroon. So the so-called Cameroon that you think is independent, their freedom fighters were fighting for its independence because they consider Amadou Ahidjo as a continuation of the French Republic in Cameroon. Amadou Ahidjo was a puppet, and that has continued till today with Paul Biya. So I want you people to see this very important documentary that France 24 has put out there, because this information are out there, but our people have not had time to view it and consider it through our own activism for our nationalism. So watch this video from this eyewitness testimony who was part of that war.
He was a helicopter pilot and witnessed several massacres committed by the Cameroonian army. It was strongly supported and funded by France.
So remember what he's saying. The Cameroon army was managed, was supported, and was funded by France. A manager is the person who actually is doing what is happening. The founder is the person who is sustaining it. By who? By France. Listen.
That's a Bell 47 G2, 280 horsepower, a very small helicopter, just 3 seats.
The Cameroonian army, backed by France, targeted members of the UPC, a party that opposed President Amadou Ahidjo. The UPC believed that after independence in 1960, Ahidjo was simply France's hand-picked puppet. For the first time on television, Max Bardet describes the atrocities he saw.
Soldiers of the Cameroonian army were ordered to kill the men, but not the women. Women would be left to agonize. Most had been wounded by AK-47 bullets. But not only that, what I want to say is that they would also cut off their breasts and disembowel them.
So this is the eyewitness, somebody who participated in that war from France. And he is explaining that the Cameroon soldiers were ordered. It will be interesting for you to know who ordered them, because we know for sure that the people who were fighting that war were the French. Were the French military. These are the people who were cutting off the heads of Cameroonians in La République du Cameroon. These were the people who were giving order to the Cameroon military that was waging this war, and they were fighting for France. So it's very important that you know what is going on and the narrative. Let's listen.
During these massacres, Max Bardet was accompanied by a French officer.
The officer who was with me was here to be on the lookout and make sure no one would witness what was going on, that no one could ever testify or accuse France and the few members of the French military still present in Cameroon.
So the French government had officers that were monitoring and making sure that there is no weakness left, that everything is kept in the dark. You have seen France still playing the same role in Ambazonia, making sure that what is happening in Ambazonia remains in the dark. They are very good at having this type of mundus operandi even in their operations till today in Ambazonia. But pay attention as we go through so that you get what we are driving ahead.
Of being involved in what was going on.
Bardet says he understands why many Cameroonians remain bitter.
If I were them, I would be angry with the French or with France.
So this is a military man, French military retired man, who fought this war from 1962 to 1964 for 2 years, fighting, killing Cameroonians, telling the war where the anger of the people of that country should be. It should be in France. Against who? France. Because he as a Frenchman was responsible. He committed those atrocities. The French officers were giving orders. The French officers were making sure nothing leaks out, that it remained hidden, the crimes they were committing against Cameroonians, who were fighting for their independence. Independence after independence. That should tell you something. Let's listen.
Yes, really, I would.
A new book on this topic called The War in Cameroon has just come out in France.
The French carried on with their military activities, albeit discreetly. They would manage or supervise operations rather than...
So remember, this is a researcher who published a book, and we are watching the documentary that was produced by France 24, telling you that it was the French war. The French were fighting a war, not Cameroon, because the French were in charge. And the French were hiding their actions, their activity, by putting Cameroon in front. So the Cameroon you see is a front for France. Listen to it again.
Cameroon has just come out in France.
The French carried on with their military activities, albeit discreetly.
So the French were carrying out their military activity according to what the researcher is saying. It is a French military activity. It was not Cameroon. What Cameroon government is doing, for the most part, you think is Cameroon doing it, is actually a French mission. They are doing the job for France. The people behind the actions are France, from France, Frenchmen from France. Listen.
They would manage or supervise operations rather than having a massive military presence on the ground.
So the French will hide behind, manage from behind, and supervise. Your supervisor. And that is evidence even in the testimony of Emmanuel Macron, when he talks about telling Paul Biya to release people from prison, ordering Paul Biya like a kid. That is to tell you that these are the people who manage Cameroon, who supervise Cameroon. No doubt they produce Cameroon's currency. It's very important that you make this connection, and you know the rule even of people like Paul Biya, who sits there as a president, but actually he's a puppet, just like Amadou Ahidjo, operating under the same system that was set up by the French government. Let's continue.
This way they could crack down on the UPC nationalists, that's the Union of Cameroonian People, but also on all those suspected of supporting this movement, the so-called subversive elements.
So I want you to pay attention. Even researchers don't get everything right, because they are focusing about the killing of UPC, but they were not killing UPC because the fighters were, for the most part, ANLK. What they are calling the subversive people, that means the population that supports the that were members of the UPC. They were the people that supported the movement for independence for Cameroon. But the fighters were actually the ones that they call Makiza was the ANLK. Those were the target, and they had orders to go after people that they consider people who support the movement. Does this sound similar to you? Cameroon military goes to Ambazonia not just to target the Ambazonian fighters that they don't want to call the names. They don't call the name of the ADF and all those groups fighting against them. But they target not just the fighters, but the people that they support the movement. And in this case, you heard that military man saying they cut the breasts of their women. They allow women to mourn. They allow people to see the body of their children to mourn, so that they will be terrorized to subject themselves under that regime and surrender. Let's continue.
This repression, this crackdown was so discreet, it was like a secret operation. Indeed, back in France, no one was aware of the extent of these military operations. But not only were these operations off the radar, they were also extremely violent. In the 1960s, you had entire villages being destroyed in air raids. People were being forced into camps surrounded with barbed wire. Torture was becoming systematic.
So you can hear exactly what is happening today. Villages burned down systematically. Population tortured and put in camps, like we see in Kondengi and many camps that Cameroon have had private prisons across our territory. Schools transformed into prisons yard, where entire population, like the video I showed you, with over 800 civilians rounded up in Bali. Most of them have disappeared. This is the modus operandi of the system you have in Cameroon. What Cameroon is doing is not something new. It is how that system operates. A system set up by Charles de Gaulle, by France, supported, funded, and supervised by France. And I want you to pay close attention, even more so, to the conclusion of this documentary.
Revelations in this book come after those published in the first edition, and they could have legal and financial consequences for France.
The French government is fully aware that the Mau Mau, a group that was violently repressed in Kenya in a similar way and at a similar time, sued the British government a few years ago and won compensations. Lawsuits are still being filed. So I think the French government wouldn't like to find itself in a similar position.
So during this same time when Cameroon was under attack by the French government and the forces that the French proxy forces, the Cameroon military is a proxy force for France. During that time, even in Kenya, you had the Mau Mau who were fighting for independence and the British government were doing the same thing. Right now, the British government have admitted, just like the France government have admitted, with classified history being exposed. The difference is that in Kenya, there have been lawsuits that were filed in against the British government and compensation have been secured. But in Cameroon, there is no lawsuit because while there is a relative freedom in Kenya and Kenya managing their affairs, the France Afrique, based on a colonial draconian system, still hold the Cameroonians and many of the former French territory by puppet regimes with absolutely no freedom of their own. So these are the things that the French government is worried about. But more importantly, I want you to pay attention to the ramification of this knowledge. The ramification of knowing that the French government is actually behind the Cameroon government, is the one actually sponsoring the Cameroon government, managing the Cameroon government, supervising the Cameroon government. You have seen the French ambassador supervising and performing duties that Paul Biya have been performing in graduating senior members of Cameroon military. You have seen all those things. Those are not stories to you. You have seen Emmanuel Macron telling the public that he is going to give orders to Paul Biya. These are not stories to you. So watch attentively to the conclusion of the ramification of these things that you know.
But they're also worried of the conclusions that could be drawn from their implication in the war in Cameroon. Because beyond the violent repression, it was one of the cornerstones in building a very peculiar system of French governance, not only in Cameroon, but in all of France's former colonies in Africa.
So, this brutal killing, maiming, torture of the entire population using the Cameroon military was the cornerstone in building a draconian, peculiar French system called the France Afrique that have been set up that continue to survive generation to generation till today. In Togo, in Ivory Coast, to a lesser extent, in Cameroon, in Gabon, where these dictators put in place by France to control and manage the activities of the French government, managed by the French government, on behalf of the French government. This is a system that has been put in place. Their money itself, you know, money, legal tender is very essential in terms of authority and who is in control, who determines value, who determines foreign policy, foreign education. These systems are still in place in all the former French colony, and Cameroon is the anchor of this system. I want you to hear again the ramification as stated by this gentleman, a researcher from France.
Peculiar system of drawn from their implication in the won compensations. Lawsuits are still being filed. So I think the French government wouldn't like to find itself in a similar position. But they're also worried of the conclusions that could be drawn from their implication in the war in Cameroon. Because beyond the violent repression, it was one of the cornerstones in building a very peculiar system of French governance, not only in Cameroon, but in all of France's former colonies in Africa. So yes, if people start taking a closer look at what happened during this war, this is something deeply worrying for the French government. And this regardless of whether the government is on the left or on the right.
So that is the crux of the matter. If we take a closer look into these activities of the French government, we are going to uncover the system, the peculiar system that the French government have put in place across Africa in all the French colony, including Cameroon. a system of brutal dictatorship and an oligarchy that the French government managed from behind, the French government supervised from behind, the French government supports fully from behind to exploit Africa for francs and let these puppet dictators benefit with their own kingsmen, usually their own tribesmen. That is exactly what we face.